afternoon, everybody. This is Sébastien Treyer, the Executive Director of IDRI. Thanks for having joined this webinar. I'm just actually speaking in order for all the participants to be able to join and understand that we are going to begin. We are reaching now 224 participants. We probably need to wait for a little bit more time, 2 to 3 minutes. So please, those who have been on time, excuse us for that, but it's the time needed for everybody to be able to enter this virtual room where we'll all be together for 90 minutes. For those of you who are already here, I mean, it's a good sign after this European Council of yesterday to see that so many people were interested to log into a webinar with different European member states' perspectives. We had, I think, something around 900 people registering, which really shows that even if Europe is complicated, we're all in it together trying to make it work. It's really a good sign. So I'll be waiting still 2 to 3 minutes. So for those of you who are logging in, we will begin shortly. So I have a question from the audience about the fact that we were supposed to be broadcasting the webinar not only through Zoom but also live streaming on YouTube, and that's what we expect to have. So if something is not functioning, our very efficient comms team is trying to deal with it if it's not the case. And for those of you who are new on Zoom, I see a question on that. Don't worry. For those of you who are just participating, you're only allowed to write and not to speak. So no worry to be unmuted. That's not going to happen. So maybe I should now try and launch the webinar. This would also be a way for the different other participants to continue joining. I see the numbers going to 417. So I'm Sébastien Treyer. I'm the Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. We are based at Sciences Po in Paris. And it's really a big pleasure for me to be able to welcome all of you who have joined the webinar, but also to welcome particularly the 3 experts from 3 different member states. So it's really a European webinar that we try to build, and we are very grateful to the 3 experts, Xavier Timbaud from OFCE in Paris, Sciences Po, Lara Lazaro-Tusa from Real Elcano Instituto in Madrid, Spain, and Matthias Bück from Agora Energiewende in Germany. And I think the very purpose of this seminar is really to understand what might be the differences in the perception of what needs to be done now in different member states across Europe, but also what we need to do in common and what can be done in common. I will be just making a few words of introduction before coming to the 3 panelists. Just in terms of how this will function, you already have discovered, I mean, many of you have already discovered that there is a question and answer button down at the bottom of the screen. QER, question et réponse in the French version, Q&A in the English version. You can type your question there. And it's actually at the end of, after the 3 presentations, that we will have a Q&A session that I will moderate based on the questions that you will ask writtenly in this Q&A box. And I will have the help of my colleague Nicolas Bermans from IDRI to try and synthesize those questions and make it feasible for the panelists to answer clustered questions. I think for those of you who are following us on YouTube, you can also write questions on the chat of the YouTube streaming. And the colleagues from the comms team at we are also going to be, we will normally be able to, of course not, but we will do our best to make sense of all the questions. I see that my own connection is not that good. I hope you're still following me. So as some words of introduction, I think it's important to refer to yesterday's European Council. And I think we have to notice that the Council progressed slightly in the definition of the EU scale response to the crisis. The emerging solution links a lot European scale recovery plans with national recovery plans. And this is this link between the 2 scales of plans seems to be at the core of the solidarity mechanism between the member states. At IDRI, we firmly believe that this needs to come with a political project for the European Union in order not to fall back in the same problems of the EU recovery after the 2008 financial crisis. We believe we are still in the aftermath, in the political aftermath of this. EU citizens had actually no vision of a joint project of our common prosperity as a long-term horizon, and to some extent were only proposed to endure. What is interesting with the current crisis is that before even the crisis emerged, we had an explicit and bold political project being proposed by the von der Leyen Commission as a result of the European elections and linked to the social mobilization on climate across the continent. The European Green Deal, and that's what we are talking about, I think we want to interpret it at IDRI as a transformation project for the economy of the whole continent, for all the economic sectors of the whole continent. And as the only winning economic positioning of the European Union in a globalized world. So it's an economic and geopolitical choice that the von der Leyen Commission had proposed. They had proposed to make, that we made jointly at the European scale. And it came as a very comprehensive policy package. And just for the sake of us being on the same page, I just wanted to raise 5 points that are defining the Green Deal. First, radically ambitious objectives for the transformation of the whole continent. Climate neutrality, zero pollution, material footprint radically reduced, biodiversity protection. If you take all these together, that necessitates radical transformation in many other sectors. Second, after the radically ambitious objectives, it came with policy and regulations. So it was not just about investments, it was about norms and laws. And the climate law was proposed before the crisis and was actually quite ambitious even in terms of governance of the EU. But for others, like the biodiversity strategy, have been postponed, and for the moment we don't know until when. The third element of the Green Deal, in my standards, are about investment plans. And that's an important part. It was already proposed using European budget tools as the EIB, European Investment Bank, and of course the idea of leveraging private money through public money, but with a vision of industrial policies in different sectors, fostering innovation and transformation in mobility, food, etc. The fourth element, after objectives, norms, and investment plan, is the social dimension. Before the crisis, it was mainly a just transition fund aimed at coal-dependent regions, and particularly for Eastern European countries. And the fifth element was external action, because diplomacy was at the heart also of the Green Deal, looking at trade and environmental standards globally, at multilateral cooperation on COP26 on climate, but also the bilateral relationships between China and the EU. So that was the Green Deal, and we believe that the political narrative still holds. 15 ministers of the environment, including from Spain, Italy, and France, who are the most hit countries by the crisis for now, have signed a letter saying we support the Green Deal as the long-term horizon. President von der Leyen and Vice President Timmermans also publicly expressed their support to that, which was not obvious because there were forces within the Commission that might not support that. And I think there is a strong vision that when South Korea and China are heading for green technologies, Europe cannot be late on that. But that might not be the only way to look at the Green Deal. I think at least it's the long-term horizon. So that was the vision before the crisis. But now we also need to see that there might not be a very big ownership by all member state citizens about the Green Deal, even if citizens like the Citizens Convention on Climate in France has expressed their support to that being the horizon to exit the crisis. We have a Czech and Polish government, the business players, who not only have expressed their will not to increase environmental ambition, thus being problematic for the overall climate ambition in Europe, but even asking for dismantling existing tools and norms on the environment. And so that's also a worry that this crisis might be a slide back. And this is why we need to understand how these different things can be analyzed from different member states. This is absolutely crucial to understand both what citizens and economic players are asking their own governments at national level. So we wanted to share a series of questions, and I'm based on this perspective that we need a political project, that the Green Deal might be an interesting political project, and not only the one that we environmentalists are proposing. But for that to be completely clear, we wanted to have a succession of questions. The first one is, can we share a diagnosis of the crisis, of what the COVID-19 is doing to our economies? We firmly believe at IDRI that it's not easy to have a relevant reference of past crises for this crisis, that there are no pre-existing examples. And so no exact references can be used in terms of the nature and duration of the crisis, nor on the nature of the responses. So the second question is, after having said what is actually this crisis, can we compare it to others? Can we compare it to other pre-existing or not? The second question is, what do we understand from the response that is proposed to this unprecedented crisis? What is the economic policy response? The third one is, what is the political demand by economic actors and by citizens in different member states? And what space is there for the ecological transition? Because citizens might be asking more for protection, resilience, reduced vulnerability, sovereignty. These are the words that we can hear in the speeches by different politicians. So is that different from one member state to the other, and how do we see the political demand? And so these three preliminary questions were a way to come to the big question of this seminar, that is, can the Green Deal be a part of the response? I've proposed myself our analysis that it's a good long-term horizon, because it is a political project that can be proposed to the citizens and to the economy. But does it stand? And how can we ensure that the emergency or recovery plans are aligned with that long-term vision? There are lots of questions behind that. So this succession of 4 questions might not be addressed by all the speakers. I just wanted to show that we want to ensure that we are not too rapid in thinking that we share an understanding of what is the diagnosis. Maybe we don't have the same diagnosis, and that's important. So I just present briefly the three experts who have accepted to discuss with us today. The first one I'll give the floor to is Xavier Timbaud from OFCE, l'Office français des conjonctures économiques, a research lab and think tank based at Sciences Po. Xavier is a specialist of macroeconomic policies. He's been a very critical and constructive analyst of the Juncker investment plans that were already, to some extent, a similar example of things that we needed to be greener and have not been greener. But Xavier also recently published papers on the impact on the French economy. So we'll try to have with Xavier answers to his understanding of what is this crisis. Can we describe, are we sharing the diagnosis, and what can be the responses, and how does it stand in France? Lara Lazaro is at Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid. For those who are not Spanish, it could be an equivalent of the British Chatham House, the French IFRI, or the German Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, so international relations think tank, the international relations think tank in Madrid. And Lara is the specialist of energy and climate policies at Elcano. She has recently published papers analyzing the climate legislation in Spain, linked with, of course, European legislation, but also perspectives on energy policies and energy markets. And we will ask Lara how she sees from Spain the national debate and the links with the European scale debate. And lastly, we also have the opportunity, and thank you very much for that, to be joined by Matthias Buck. Matthias is director for European Union at Agora Energiewende, a think tank in Germany that is for a very long time already the prominent think tank on the energy transition in Germany. And Agora has published recently a paper on the three horizons of relief, recovery, and reform, and leading to detailed proposals for very critical sectors of the German economy on which we all have our eyes targeted, like the automotive industry or the chemical industry. And so we'll ask Matthias how we can both help us understand what's happening in Brussels, because that's his job to follow what's happening in Brussels, but also what's the German vision. So that was a long introduction. I'm very sorry for that. I without further ado, give the floor to Xavier, with the idea that you could help us, you could walk through your analysis of the crisis, of the nature of the responses that can be given, and how you see what we can understand from this response and it links to the Green Deal. So, Xavier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you very much for putting all that together and gathering such an impressive audience, and I'm very pleased to participate to this seminar. What I'm going to present is the work we are currently doing on evaluating the impact of the crisis. I hope you're not going to be too much disappointed, because we are focusing on the short-term consequences, and all the questions that Sebastian has pointed, and which are very important questions, are short-term questions. Our long-term questions. So, well, there I do share with him the idea that we need to agree on the diagnosis for the short term, but unfortunately at this point I'm not going to be able to fuel any thing for the long term, or not much things for the long term. I try at the end of the presentation. I'll be quite brief. I'm sorry also this is in French. We are working a lot of those days to make those evaluations. This is in French. We are in a process of translating some of the papers we are doing. But well, what is going to be important are the numbers, and the numbers are universal. Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly through that. What we have done at this point is to estimate the impact of the lockdown on the economy. The lockdown is the main event, as a matter of fact, related to this crisis. This is, of course, a health crisis in the first place, but the economic impact is coming through the lockdown, and the lockdown, of course, I'm not going to argue that is justified by the health crisis, but at this point there is no impact of the health question on the economy, or not sufficiently to be taken in consideration. So most of the economic impact goes through the lockdown and all the consequences, and you're going to see that it's quite exceptional. So what we have looked at is 8 weeks of lockdown in France. This is very similar in other countries. There are some slight differences between countries, but the main idea is there. When you are in a lockdown, the GDP, economic activity, is reduced by 30%. And 30%, you should not be mistaken by this number, because in this number there is a lot of non-market activities. There is also some economic activities like rents, which are in national accounting part of the added value of households, which are not moving during the crisis. So if you focus on the market economy, all economic transactions which are based on a monetary exchange, then the impact of the lockdown is much higher. It's something in the range of 47%, nearly 50% of market economy. So this is a huge shock on the economy, a very temporary one. It's going to stand for 8 weeks, maybe more, because there will be a partial unlockdown of the economy, and then there will be some longer term consequences. But what we are looking there is really the 8 first weeks of the lockdown. So this is a huge, very brutal, very immediate impact on the economy. This is absolutely not an ordinary recession. And one way to understand that is to look at the way it's having an impact on the economy. In most European countries, and this is quite different in the US, but in most European countries, what has been done by government is to find any ways to support the household income in that situation. That goes through quite a wide range of mechanisms. One of them being what we call chômage partiel or partial activity. That is to say, the idea that you're going to be unemployed and declared as such by your enterprise or by yourself. You're not going to be fired. So you're going to keep your contract with your employer, but you're going to be paid by a collective body, which is going to take place of your employer in order to pay you. It's supposed to stand for the time of the lockdown, or at least the time of the period of time in which you can apply the criteria which declare you as unemployed, and in order to get into that mechanism. Because of that,
just to ensure, because there is a question, your numbers are for the French situation and not global.
No, yeah, the numbers are for the French situation. There you should take the French situation as an example for European countries. There are some slight differences between countries because the shock is not exactly the same in every country. For instance, the lockdown has been stronger and stricter, for instance, in Spain or in Italy than it has been in the Netherlands or in Germany. But roughly, you get nearly the same numbers. It's in the range of, let's say, for a week of lockdown, this is between 25 and 50% impact on GDP. So that's a huge difference, but that makes the mechanism quite similar and quite the same. So, well, as you support the income, as you keep the income of household or most households constant, what it means is that you restrain consumption and you keep income. So what you've got is savings. So during this period of time, and this is the example of France, for 8 weeks of lockdown, there are going to be 55 billion euros of savings which are going to be accumulated by French households. This is something in the range of more than 4 points of their annual income. So this is a huge number. And one of the key of that very specific period of very specific recession is going to know how these savings are going to be spent or not at the end of the lockdown and during the rest of the year and next year. Okay, one thing which is very difficult, and I'm not going to be very accurate on that because we don't have completely the information and we are currently working on that, is that lockdown is not over. It's not going to be over, for instance, in France on the 10th or 11th of May. It's going to continue. It's going to continue in a different form, but there will be economic impact as well of the lockdown going on up until the summer and probably going on after the summer. We are not sure that there are not going to be again some lockdown in the next future weeks due to a surge in the pandemic locally, and so there will be a lot of uncertainty in the economy due to that. So what we have done is to analyze the shock So this is a demand and supply shock. Demand in the sense that consumption is restrained, supply in the sense that some people are not going to go to work. It has not the same sectoral analysis. What we are using this shock to calculate. So this is we look at technically the demand side of the economy. So we inject that into input-output matrix, and then we've got the sectoral production. So we get that kind of number for France, for instance, with quite an heterogeneous impact. For instance, this sector, which is hotel and restaurants and bars, is heavily hit by the shock, much more than, for instance, is the agriculture and industry, which are related to agriculture, producing food, which is less impacted. So, okay, but what is important is that you've got this impact on the economy, which is different from one sector to another, but there is a widespread impact.
Excuse me, Xavier, I still need to interrupt you for clarification questions.
Sorry.
No problems. I'm sorry to interrupt. The one question was on your first slide on the 32% of reduction of what? And I wanted to, if I'm not mistaken, it was of the added value creation during 1 week.
So this is GDP. So this is 32% of total GDP, market and non-market activities. And this is for 1 week or 1 month of lockdown. So this is the relative loss of GDP during the lockdown. So this is during the period of the lockdown. And then if you have 2 weeks of, if you have 8 weeks of lockdown at 32%, it's going to bring a 5% fall in annual GDP, simply due to 8 weeks of 30% lockdown. So going from that number to that number is quite simple. This is simply multiplying by 8 and dividing by 52. So 8 over 52 weeks times 32% equal 5%.
And so can you just relate to the numbers on the slide you've just been presenting? The percentages per branch were also the same type of
so this is the breakdown of that number for the whole economy. So this is the black bar there, which is 32% there. And you've got the breakdown for all branches, all sectors in the economy. But this is related to the value added of that branch. So for instance, for the bar and restaurants and hotels, this is something in the range of 75% loss in value added. In construction, for instance, this is nearly 85%. So those are huge numbers. I mean, you can't, well, we have never experienced such a situation where some branches are completely or nearly stopped by the crisis. It's looking like entering a war, as a matter of fact. But one very important thing is the what we call the compte d'argent. This is when we get all the picture for all the economic sectors in the economy, so households, public sector, firms, and so on, and rest of the world. We can, using all that work, we can rebuild those accounts for all the economic sectors in the economy, and so we can look at who's taking the hit, the initial hit. Okay, I'm skipping that one to get to that slide there. Well, I will nearly conclude. So what we got there is that there is a huge shock on the economy. So you can see in terms of billions, this is this line, which is important. This is 125 billion euro, which is lost during the 8 weeks of lockdown. Of those 125 billion euros, there is 11 billions which are falling onto the households and small entrepreneurs. So this is quite a high number, but this is only a little bit less than 10% of the overall shock. 42 billion euros are falling on firms, non-financial and financial sector, and that's a third of the initial shock. The rest, 55%, 57% is falling on the public sector. Nearly 2/3 of the shock is taken by the public sector. So you see there the result of the policies and all the measures which have been taken during the crisis. Preserving household income allows to reduce the initial impact on households. There is a little bit of impact on households because there are small entrepreneurs. There are some people who are not well covered by all the dispositives, all the mechanisms. There are some people who are unemployed and are not going to get a job, for instance, and so they are going to lose relatively to compared to a scenario where there was no crisis. So some households are losing, but that's well absorbed by public policies. But there is still a lot of strain which is going onto the enterprises, onto the firms. What has been done is to give some time for all firms to pay their to pay their taxes and social contributions. So that's giving them some relief on the cash constraint, but at some point of time, they will have to pay. And for the moment, this is going to be a huge blow to the private sector profitability, and so that can have some further consequences in the future. So let me conclude on this slide. Well, this is completely in French, but nevertheless, I'm going to say it, even if you can't read it. So what is important now is, well, we start from this very special point where we have a huge shock, a lockdown of the economy, literally. Mostly income of households is sustained by public policies. There is a part of the shock which is on the firms, and so now is what's going to happen next. So next thing is probably households are going to spend some, maybe all of the money they have saved during the lockdown. But if they save only 10% of this extra saving that they have done during the lockdown, it's going to be 0.4 of their income which is going to be saved, and 0.4 of the income which is saved brutally by households is sufficient to trigger another kind of recession, which is not the kind we are currently on, but another one where a large part of demand is going to miss from economic activity. If you add to that the initial shock to the firm accounts, which are going to be severely damaged by this period of lockdown, well, we expect that there are going to be some public policies there to put some relief on that shock, but, well, it's not clear at that point. Then you have all the recipes for an ongoing recession afterward. There are going to be other problems. Probably there are going to be some structural changes in consumption. For instance, people are not going to travel abroad, or much less. In some economies like France, for instance, where international tourism is quite an important part of the economy, that's going to be also a structural impact on economic activity. We're going to lose that positive external balance we have on tourism. There are going to be some uncertainty in the economy. We are not completely sure of the way the pandemic is going to unfold. And then you can add to all that some international questions. The first one is how other economies are going to go on during this crisis, and what's going to be the impact on the external demand for all countries. And then you can have also secondary and autonomous crises which are going to unfold also, for instance, financial crisis, or crises fueled by the risk of default on public debt, and so on. So all that is bringing a quite difficult situation during the lockdown, but also after the lockdown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xavier. So that was the way you analyze the French situation. I believe there are some questions that we will come back to about to what extent is that specific because of the way the French state and welfare state is taking positions to protect jobs, etc., or to protect businesses. So I prefer that you do not answer now, but I think it's useful to have in mind maybe for our two other experts, and then we will come back to that in the Q&A to understand to what extent it's a different situation in Spain if the social state is different, or in Germany if the link with the jobs and the way the government supports jobs might be different. So based on this analysis of what is the diagnosis of the crisis in France, I would like to give the floor to Lara to tell us from your side in Spain, what are the analysis of the crisis, the responses, and how that links or not to ambitious climate policies or environmental policies in the short or in the longer run. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to share this panel with such distinguished speakers, and it's great to collaborate again with you. So the analysis from the Bank of Spain is similar as the one just presented by Xavier. The Bank of Spain analyzes two scenarios, one from the supply side and one the quarterly Bank of Spain model, and the figures of GDP drop range between 6.6% of GDP and 13.6% of GDP, depending on the number of weeks we will be going in lockdown. The state of alarm has just been extended until the 9th of May, and it might not be the end of it, as Xavier also pointed out. So quite a steep drop in our GDP as well. We also expect impacts in our public deficit and public debt, also as mentioned by Xavier. In terms of unemployment rate, and again, stressing that these figures are highly uncertain, that they've been changing from the initial moments of the crisis to the latest published figures by both the Bank of Spain and the IMF. There are slight differences there. Spain's unemployment rate, as some of you probably know, is quite high, higher than the Eurozone, and we entered we left 2019 with just over 13%, and we expect this year, and again, these are preliminary figures, to go up to 16% of unemployment rate. So it's quite a dramatic increase. So for the question that you sent me about how the national debate is evolving in this crisis, obviously all of the political attention is focused on responding to the health crisis. We have over 213,000 people infected, over 22,000 people dead. So the government is basically responding to the health emergency and the social emergency. As for what this means for climate policies in particular, I think we have to analyze the different stakeholders. So the government, the coalition government, socialist and far left, Unidas Podemos, I think there's a stern defense of the legislative elements that the socialist government and the coalition government have developed from 2018 forward. So first the socialist government until the 10th of November this year, and then the coalition government. As you mentioned in your initial comments, Teresa Rivera, our VP and Minister for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge, signed the Alliance for a Green Recovery, as have other political parties. The message from the government is clearly that green recovery is non-negotiable, that the European Green Deal is non-negotiable, that a resilient recovery is a must if we are to be prepared by the unfolding climate crisis. So if we are going into a deep hole, the idea of coming out of it and going to the abyss and going back to previous economic models is really not the way forward. And the way forward is to hold on to the legislative and executive plans that they have put forward. That includes the draft climate change and energy transition law that will hopefully be adopted soon. That includes the National Energy and Climate Change Plan, which in the latest update has 241 billion in investments, 80% expected from the private sector, sorry, so 20% coming from the public sector, 80% coming from the private sector, and obviously this might suffer the consequences of the coronavirus COVID-19 crisis. The actions taken so far have been, as has been in the case in Germany, introduced temporary interest rate tax deferrals, suspended enforcement of some debt contracts, put in place targeted cash transfers for self-employed and small, medium-sized enterprises. Spain has also expanded eligibility for unemployment benefits and exempted some of the firms that are maintaining employment from social contributions, and offered loan guarantees for firms. So all of these are things that have been put forward for the moment. In terms of what the opposition parties are doing, well, previous to the COVID-19 crisis, and in terms of the implementation arm of our Paris Agreement and our European goals, there have been, in contrast to, for example, the UK, 3 different proposals for the climate change and energy transition law. So there is an appetite, political appetite, to have such a legislative framework. When you analyze the numbers, when you compare the numbers across the different political parties, they are different, but they're not so wide apart as to prevent the adoption of a climate change and energy transition law. This was the case prior to COVID-19. And the proposals were put forward by the Popular Party, so the Conservative Party, Unidas Podemos, so the far left, which is now part of the coalition government, and the latest proposal by the Socialist Party. So coming into the crisis, what we see is that Ciudadanos, which is part of Renew in Europe, have also supported the European Alliance for a Green Recovery. The Popular Party have some members of the EPP have also supported, as you probably know, the European Alliance for a Green Recovery. In Spain, they are asking in public events to think or rethink about the requirements and the goals within the national energy and climate change programs. They are asking for this recovery phase to not include specifically conditionality. So I haven't heard from them this conditionality requirement, which is part of the narrative from the socialist / Unidas Podemos government. So that's a difference. And Vox, which is the far right, we have 52 seats in Parliament at the moment. They have never wanted a climate change and energy transition law. They have questioned whether climate change is man-made, and they have put forward the idea that policies to arrest climate change are due to obscure interests. So that I don't think there's going to be any support for any increase in ambition or green recovery. Although they have put forward in their programs, in their political programs in the past, the fact that they're concerned about energy independence. So national security and energy independence as being issues that are of interest to the far right. In terms of the firms, of how the firms are evolving and how this debate is evolving in the private sector, we see a clear divide. We see some firms, especially in the renewable energy sector, that have signed up for to the Green Recovery Alliance. And within this Green Recovery Alliance, the asks are basically in line with the OECD to evaluate the possible unintended negative environmental impacts of the response to the COVID crisis, the no rolling back of existing environmental standards, the conditionality, the idea of resilience, and the need to communicate effectively. So that is one side of the debate within the private sector. On the other side of the debate, we have big business associations, including the car makers, oil refiners, paper, chemistry, and pharmaceuticals, beverages and food, cement. And this, a few days ago, they published a statement asking the Spanish government to support public investment in infrastructures, public housing and rehabilitation, to support increased demand for cars. That doesn't distinguish between internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles, reduction of taxes to sectors that are exposed to international competition, to reduce the cost of energy, so get rid of generation tax and make sure that indirect costs of CO2 are compensated, and promote measures to increase access to international markets and increase exports. As for civil society, so there's a clear split both in the political arena and in the private sector. As for civil society, there's a manifesto by 50 European NGOs, which includes 7 Spanish ones, asking basically for a green recovery and for conditionality in their stimulus, and highlighting the need to avoid a lock-in in technologies and projects that can become stranded assets. So therefore stressing that the risk of both physical risk and transition risks are still there and that we shouldn't forget about them. As for citizens, we conducted 2 surveys at Elcano, both with a sample size of 1,000 individuals, representative of the Spanish population, with a margin of error of 3.2%. For a 95.5% confidence interval. And what we see here, we asked about the concern for climate change. The first data that I'm going to provide is a study that was conducted last year, so prior to the COVID crisis, so we have to bear this into account. So Spanish citizens see climate change as the greatest concern, greatest threat facing the world. This will probably change. We also asked whether Spain was doing enough to address climate change, and by and large, people from all walks of the political spectrum said that we weren't doing enough. There's a slight difference between those in the right and those in the left, but overall, Spanish people think that we're not doing enough. There was also very broad support for climate legislation. So we asked them specifically if they would support a climate change and energy transition law, and building on the research that we conducted with the London School of Economics, with Alina Robertson-Kova at the Grantham Research Institute, we identified the elements, the instruments, and the processes that would have to be considered in order to develop and implement a robust climate law. It's interesting to see that in Spain, we don't trust politicians very much, but we do trust scientists, and we want our politicians to be guided by science. Again, this would have to be re-asked in a future survey, but I think the role of science and scientists has been reinforced with the COVID crisis. So my guess would be that this will not change in the future, and that the role of science, there's an opportunity, a window of opportunity for reinforcing the role of science in climate laws, both at the EU level and at member state level. We also see, and this is data from a survey that we just conducted, and it was conducted, the fieldwork started prior to the state of emergency, but it continued during the state of emergency. So some of the effect of the COVID crisis might be reflected in the data. 61% of our samples said that they thought we were in a state of emergency. So it might be the case that we still have very broad support for acting on climate change. We also see that there's support for restricting traffic within cities, and I think that the latest reports, amongst others by Harvard University. It's a project in Harvard saying that there's a relationship. They don't talk about causality, but they talk about, if I'm not mistaken, correlation between those places, those cities that are, those areas that are more polluted, that have higher levels of air pollution, and the rate of mortality by COVID. So I think there's sort of this idea that restricting traffic in cities could be the way forward, and perhaps this data reflects that. But we would have to sort of repeat this analysis a bit later on, if time and funding allows. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara. I think it's really, for someone confined in Paris, it's really interesting to understand how you see the situation in Madrid and in Spain, and hearing that it's actually quite similar, that citizens are actually interested in not building up the economy of before the crisis. That's an interesting understanding. So I saw a lot of the questions, and I will come back to many of your questions after I've given the floor to Matthias. And I think some of your questions are about, could we understand better the European response? And so maybe not all your the answers to all your questions will come with Matthias. But Matthias, please,
okay,
maybe you can help us out in that.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I will start with a few reflections. Let me just share my screen. I hope it works. Wait, here we are. Can you see it?
Still not.
And now? So it should work. Sorry, now it works. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just go to presentation mode. Okay, so a few words before I go into the EU level. So very much like Xavier and Lara described, the situation in Germany, I think, is in broad terms comparable, a bit different. So it is absolutely comparable. We do have an economic crisis that is caused by a lockdown that is the consequence of a pandemic, and so a public policy decision to protect the old and the vulnerable by the lockdown. And there's an economic shock, and very much as Xavier described, the main economic sectors are about the same. What has happened in Germany, the current situation today is we have, as of yesterday, slightly over 150,000 corona infections registered. Of course, there's always the questions, how many are still out there that have not been registered. Compared to other countries, I believe the German test capacity is quite high. So if there's a suspicion and you go to a doctor, there's a fair chance you are getting a test at the moment. So the testing capacity has been ramped up significantly. There are about 5,300 deaths as of yesterday, a bit more than that. But encouragingly, also we have more than 100,000 registered infections that have recovered from the pandemic. Now, this being said, there is the government took some very bold short-term emergency measures in the volume of 156 billion euros, and very much targeting the most urgent needs that Xavier described. So hospitals, short-term kind of paying for people not working, still continuing to pay their salary, and giving particularly liquidity to SMEs, particularly hard hit by the crisis. But the volume of this package was very significant compared to other member states in Europe. Now, Sebastian, you asked the question, do we share the diagnosis of the crisis? Yes, I believe I do share what Xavier and Lara has said. And what is the economic policy response? So the short-term economic policy response, the relief of the emergency, to me seems very similar. And now we're discussing the recovery from the crisis. And here, coming to your basic question, does this need to be, should this be a green economic recovery? And from Agora side, we firmly believe it must be a green economic recovery. Why? For two reasons. First, the public funds available today and in the next years are limited, and there's a very high risk that if governments are now spending essentially all that they have in the coffers, there is simply not sufficient spending power left for the very significant investments that we know exist to achieve the transformation to zero greenhouse gas emissions across the European continent. And secondly, it is a fact that many of the life cycle of the investments, the lifetimes of the investments done over the next years are reaching beyond 2050. So if we are talking about investments in infrastructure, if we're talking about investments in housing renovation, if we're talking investments also in industry, giving money to industry, to infrastructure development, to household, then of course we need to be mindful of the long-term perspective beyond 2050, where we must be greenhouse gas neutral across the European continent. So from that perspective, there's really no either or, but it needs to go hand in hand. And this is, as many, I believe, see the debate. And now I'm going briefly through a few slides on this. At the European level, I think this dual perspective, the recovery efforts and the climate change challenge need to be tackled together, is shared broadly. And Sebastian, you were referring to this. So the Commission leadership at this point is sticking to the Green Deal narrative as Europe's growth strategy. There was a bit of a shaky situation for some weeks, but we have seen a very good push by member state ministers. We have seen a very prominent letter project, open letter project, initiated by Pascal Canfin, the chair of the Environment Committee in the European Parliament. And these have really balanced the calls by industry lobbies to dismantle or reopen, or at least delay, some of the climate legislation that exists in Europe. Now, what has happened from the Commission side, the Commission has announced to postpone some of the Green Deal projects. This goes for the biodiversity strategy, this goes for the farm to fork, so more the agriculture, natural resources things. They're not postponing the legislative projects on increasing climate ambition in Europe. They're not postponing all the financing context that we need, so the clarity on the financial framework, and they're also not postponing the main instruments on infrastructure development in Europe. So in my understanding, they're doing the right thing of prioritizing now, really keeping on track with those Green Deal deliverables that are really necessary also for a green recovery. Prime example at this point probably is building renovation. They're very much pushing on building renovation. Why? Because it is heavy on jobs creation, heavy on value creation, long-lasting effects, very good for the economy. Now, the debate really at political level on the recovery has been whether or not the recovery programs governments are now putting on track will add to national debt of those member states already heavily indebted. And this is a very contentious and divisive issue. I will not go into any details. Xavier is probably much better placed to comment on that than I am. But as a citizen, I'm still concerned that this could really become a major divisive issue in Europe. What has happened yesterday at heads of state when in the European Council meeting, they have yes, agreed on a framework on how to revisit these very divisive issues, but they have not yet resolved those issues. So now we will be seeing the same questions on what is the solidarity sharing, how much of the financing challenge is something that is done mutually through the European Investment Bank or European Central Bank, how much of this will fall onto national deficits. This debate is still open, and it will only now be taken in I believe, in a more useful, more structured way, in view of concrete financing needs in concrete regions in Europe. So if there's a real benefit from the decisions yesterday, I think it is of trying to unpack a bit this very divisive and complex yes, no Corona bonds discussion, to bring it more to the ground, to the reality on the ground. Where are the specific needs in Europe? Where is the highest impacts? And where is the biggest need for help? Now, where the Commission in particular has not been so engaging, in my view, is on the issue of state aid. A very large part of the stimulus packages governments are now developing are qualifying as state aid. And the Commission, as some of the listeners may not know, has exclusive competence to judge whether state aid, whether national measures are state aid compatible, yes or no. Now, there has been a tendency of state aid decision making to really shield itself from all other public policy objectives except pure market functioning. And in our understanding, given the dual crisis of the pandemic and the climate crisis, we need to see that state aid decisions are taken conscious of also the larger challenge of decarbonization and greenhouse gas neutrality. Specific example, would the Commission allow a car scrappage scheme, which will then be leading to buying of SUVs at large scale, where we all know that this is not the right way to go? Or would the Commission approve scrapping oil-fired heating and replace it by gas-fired heating, where we also know that this is not the future for household heating systems? So this is open at this point in time, and many are pushing for this. The German debate, very much condensed, has been at narrative level, we are okay. When it comes to the details, we are stuck. So we have been stuck prior to COVID-19 in the German energy transition debate. There are ongoing quarrels within the two coalition government parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats. There are quarrels between the Länder level and the federal level. So on all the important files, be it the coal phase-out agreement that was reached at political level, but has not been transposed in legislation, be it on the accelerated building up of renewables, onshore wind in particular is a problem. We are just in these days running into a quantitative cap on support given to solar PV. 52 gigawatts is the cap. The government has not been able to remove the cap, despite this being an explicit commitment in the coalition treaty. It's still hanging there. Building renovation is also not progressing as it should. The same for carbon pricing. There has been an agreement to introduce carbon pricing also for heating and transport sectors, and this is still waiting transposition into legislation. So this has been the situation before COVID-19. There has been growing frustration in industry, trade unions, civil society, really about the seeming lack, the inability of the government to just take decisions, put out laws, leading to the Green Party consistently polling in second place for some time, actually challenging in some polls the Christian Democrats in first place. Now, where we do have seen some encouraging momentum is on greenhouse gas neutral industry. We have had an encouraging dialogue with industry on how to transform to greenhouse gas neutrality. Particularly the steel and the cement industries are engaging on this, and on the hydrogen economy. And we have seen some real commitments by German car makers, particularly Volkswagen, to go full scale into electric mobility. Now, this being said, prior to COVID-19, the 2020 as well as the 2030 climate targets of the German government were clearly out of reach unless more far-reaching measures would have been taken. Now, since the outbreak, we would have never suggested a lockdown to reach the 2020 climate targets. But according to our calculations, the pure economic shock of the lockdown, of course, also is resulting in a very significant drop in emissions. This is a one-off drop. Now, it will also mean that the 2020 climate target of Germany will likely be achieved. But however, due to the inaction on climate and energy legislation, beyond this, we do not see at this point that this will have any positive effect on the 2030 climate targets, but there we do continue to see the need for much accelerated action. The hydrogen discussion is ongoing. There's an increasing emphasis on green hydrogen. This is interesting to see, but the hydrogen strategy has not been formally adopted. And there is, as I was saying, at the political narrative level, really support to embed the economic recovery in the European Green Deal. But of course, as Lara was saying, when push comes to shove, when we see specific decisions, the jury is still out whether this will be followed through. Now, to help the debate, we have put on paper a proposal for 100 billion euros recovery package that is trying to chart the debate on how a recovery package could also contribute to long-term climate and energy transition targets. The important evolution that we took ourselves when developing this package is, first, it needs to be a very clear industry by industry perspective. So we're not doing the usual thing. We are not just repackaging ideas that we have been proposing over the past years, but really we need to identify those spendings which give the highest value in terms of job creation and long-term economic stimulus, but also contribute to climate action. So we came up with in yet to be published in English paper, and I will just pull out 3 and then points, and then I'm done and open for discussion. So we have looked across the different sectors. In the power sector, in Germany, we have, and going to the violet box, we have a particular situation that the end consumer electricity price is very high compared in Europe. We have, I believe, the second or even the highest end consumer electricity price in Europe, due in particular to a very high amount of charges, levies, taxes on the price. Now, one of the proposals that we have been making is that the end consumer electricity price should be reduced by 5 cents per kilowatt hour. This would give about 20% relief to households and 25% to business, and of course have a dual effect. It would increase, benefit the spending power of households and industry. It would put them into a better economic place. And second effect is it would also make the electricity-led decarbonization comparatively cheaper compared to the other sectors, so industry, heating, and transport. The bigger picture, of course, is that we will now also, as a result of the crisis, see very low oil prices and gas prices, potentially for a longer time. So also very high power prices are a problem if electricity-led decarbonization is the fastest way to decarbonize. The second point I want to highlight is industry. We are suggesting to effectively front load some of the necessary investments for moving towards a greenhouse gas neutral industry. So to help industry make some of the first investments in large scale green steel production, low carbon cement production, and to complement this through demand side measures, green public procurement, but also what we call carbon contracts for difference to reduce the production costs. For the European level, I just wanted to, we also have a few ideas there. I just want to flag that we had quite some discussion on the middle way between Corona bonds and just national spending. And we consider that the European Investment Bank is probably a very good candidate to really help transformative large-scale transformative investments in Europe, in different regions, in member states, without increasing national deficits, because the European Investment Bank could issue bonds that could be bought by the European Central Bank, so they would be sitting in the European Central Bank and not in national budgets. So I leave it there, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So your interventions have raised a lot of questions, and I'll try to, and that is really a sign that you've been touching on very important points. I think there are things that we might not be able to address directly, but are worth mentioning. Some of our colleagues are saying, we talk a lot about climate, but there is the whole issue of biodiversity, and we seem to have a Green Deal that focuses a lot on climate rather than biodiversity. That might be the case, but if you want to react at some point, don't hesitate about that, to intervene on that. And another point that is quite difficult to tackle, because we are all in Western Europe, is what do Eastern Europe countries think? And particularly because they seem to be less hit by the virus, and at the same time to be the ones who have been resisting the Green Deal. But I think the two, I have two first clusters of questions that might be important. The first ones emerged from Xavier's presentation. A lot of the participants are wondering, wow, these 55 billion euros of savings from the households in France. This is a lot of money. Are they evenly spread across the population, or so how can we have a more distributive understanding of what happens with the crisis? The same questions were also asked actually also on the size of businesses. Do all the businesses, be they SMEs or larger businesses, have the same types of losses? But to some extent, I want to focus on the savings, and people were thinking, we have this contradiction between an increase in the debt of governments and the very large savings. Wouldn't there be other solutions to be thought of to this crisis than just the investment plans increasing the debt that is already high because of the support to jobs? So I think there would be a usefulness here to discuss what are the different types of solutions. Some participants were asking, could we not ask, is there something about when these savings come back to consumption after the crisis, shouldn't we orient those towards more green consumption patterns? Isn't there something about financial regulation bodies or ECBs or IMF to play a role if there is this contradiction between high levels of debts and high levels of savings to make things happen? And wouldn't there be the necessity to have a climate change the mandate of the European Central Bank? Or is the solution, as for the crisis, the former crisis, mainly an investment plan? And I think that's one of the first cluster of questions that I think would be very useful, particularly targeting Xavier, but of course the others. I will go directly to the second clusters of questions, so you might all pick on the ones that you think might be more relevant. The second cluster of questions is about the investment plan. A colleague from the Tageszeitung in Berlin is asking, what are the pitfalls of 2008 that we should avoid? Could we try and use the comparison? And if the investment plan is a solution, how do you look at this question that Lara particularly focused upon, but also Matthias, of conditionality? How can we make conditionality to the bailouts, to the investment plan on agriculture, aviation, and in particular the oil and gas sector? So what are the sectors on which we should put some conditionality, and to what extent is that going to be acceptable, given the level of jobs that we have, for instance, in the oil and gas industry? Another question from the colleague from the newspaper saying, if you had to choose 3 sectors, which would be those ones that you would focus the investment plan or the recovery plan on? And another question in the same line from our colleagues from Notre Europe, who's asking, there is a trade-off between being quick in the recovery plan and being green. If you want to be quick, you might just continue supporting the jobs in the SUV automobile industry. So would you, if you had to make a guess of the percentage of the recovery plans that you would like to have as green and quick, what would be the guess? How much of the green projects can we put into the recovery plan because they are green enough? Would you, I mean, maybe you have a percentage, a guess on the percentage, but it's rather, could we discuss about that? And I think on the investment plan, the other question is, that means a lot of reconversion of jobs, requalification of jobs, if we want to condition out of aviation, out of oil and gas. Is there a way that we can think of this reorientation of jobs, requalification, reconversion, and somebody proposed, for instance, innovation? If you help those people be entrepreneurs in innovative sectors, would that be a solution? So these are very large questions, but I think it revolves a lot around the idea, is the investment plan the major type of economic response? And could you go a little bit into details of how much can it be greener? I mean, you've already presented, Matthias, your investment plan, but some of the questions are important. But first, I wanted to ask Xavier, is the investment plan the solution, or shouldn't we be thinking of these debt savings paradox a little bit differently through other means of response? Xavier, your microphone.
That's okay. Definitively, I would recommend to think in 2 phases. The first one is how to unleash the savings which have been accumulated during the crisis, and there could be many ways. You can think of a spontaneous unleashing of those savings, but also you can think of using some tools to direct or even to tax those savings in order to, because there are some distributive issues behind those savings. So, that could be a first phase of the recovery. And then a second one is going to deal with all the aftermath of that. The aftermath is going to be very difficult because there are plenty of things which are unclear. How much of the savings are going to go into the economy, and how much is going to be saved as a precautionary saving? What are going to be the consequences of the huge hit to the private sector and to the businesses in the private sector? How are they going to recover that? The public policies toward the private sector are still unclear in most countries, at least in France. And that is going to be a very difficult recovery. And there are some sectoral issues that you have mentioned, for instance, in the air transportation, but also in the plane production, in the oil and gas sector, and so on. So there are going to be plenty sectoral and structural issues there, which are going to be difficult. But there is also the whole question of tourism, which is an important part of the way people live, the way they move, the places where they move, and it has also an impact on the carbon footprint they have on the world. Tourism is one of the way you can analyze the carbon footprint. So all that is going to be very complex. And so I think that the investment plan is for a second phase, where you will want to deal with those issues, which are going to be a mix of finding a way to have an economic recovery, because you can end up even in Europe with some high unemployment numbers after all that. Everything is done to escape that fatality in the short term, but the ongoing of the crisis is going to be quite complex. So there are scenarios where there are going to be some unemployment, and so you will have to deal with that, and you are going to have to deal with the sectoral issues. I took the liberty to answer some of the questions by typing. And I'm not sure, but I think that it is accessible to everyone. So there are some clarification questions and some very interesting questions, for instance, regarding the distribution of the savings. So we don't really know, but we suspect that it's more high in the higher deciles of the income distribution than in the lower ones. We also suspect that there is a huge differences between small businesses and large ones, and so on. So, but definitively, I would argue to think about all that in two phases, and behind those two phases are very, very different outcomes. It's very hard to make the first one a green one, because the issue there is going to find a way for people who have saved money not going to bar and restaurants mostly, but that money is on their bank account, and it's hard to say to them spend it green, because well, they probably will ask to spend it the way they want to spend it, and if you send them to complex messages, there is a risk that they are not going to spend it anyway. So well, if they don't spend it, you can think about taxing it. That's going to be quite difficult to do, and taxation is not very popular those days in Europe, especially after the 2008 crisis. So I would be very careful in that phase on the way you deal with the behavior of people. And then in a second phase, you can, and I think that the second phase also can be really fueled by an in-depth reflection on what this crisis is saying about the way we live. And I think that people are in need to take all the lessons from that quite difficult crisis and to understand where it is coming from. Yeah, there are some questions about biodiversity. I think that for sure we have been focused on climate change, and maybe it's time we deal with biodiversity, and maybe this is the good moment to take stock on biodiversity due to the link between biodiversity and viruses. And just to finish, one of the most important mistakes not to reproduce that was done in 2008 and not to reproduce today is the question of public debt and market discipline on public debt. That is very, very important. If we once again fail on that, what has been escaped from last time, which was the fall down of the Eurozone, is not going to be possible. So, well, there are very high stakes there, and I think that people are not going to understand why a few more GDP points of public debt, because this is not necessarily going to be so high in the end due to the crisis. The numbers are quite impressive, but then if you compare them to 2008, we are an order of magnitude below that at this point. So if with an order of magnitude below what was in 2008, we end up with the same issues and the same problems and the same rise in sovereign interest rates, then people are not going to understand what is not working. And well, if you want to live with high savings and high debts, and you will be forced to do that for some time, then you have to think about this question of sovereign rates, and this issue is one we should not fail in this crisis.
Thank you, Xavier. I was intending to give the floor next to Lara. Is that okay for you, Lara?
Sure.
On these questions of the investment plans or other issues, and within the investment plans, which sectors, and particularly these questions about the energy sector that you might be wanting to pick up.
Sure. So in terms of conditionality and where it is acceptable, I think looking at what the government has sort of flagged in Spain, the conditionality is going to be basically focused on the transport sector, on the aviation sector in particular, and on the oil and gas sector, and also in the energy intensive sector. So the idea would be to ask them to align their strategies with net zero and have interim targets. So I think the conditionality is going to go down that route. So trajectories to net zero. In terms of the sectoral policies, I concur with, I don't know whether it was Xavier or Matthias who said that investing, I think it was Matthias who said investing in energy efficiency in buildings and rehabilitation would be, one of the top priorities because of how job intensive it is. In the National Energy and Climate Change Plan in Spain, the goal is to have 1.2 million houses rehabilitated or buildings rehabilitated by 2030. Now, our track record of rehabilitation, it has not been great in the past, so we have to take that with a pinch of salt, with some caution, but that would be one of the sectors for sure. Transport, it's 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Spain, so I think that will be one of the biggest focus. There are several measures in the National Energy and Climate Change Plan in Spain, including tax reform in the road taxes and in the taxation of transport in general. There are several measures, and in terms of requalification of jobs, I think probably France, correct me if I'm wrong, but the just transition contracts, we're in a very different world to 2008. We have goals for the middle of the century. We have shovel-ready policies and plans, and we have started experimenting with things such as just transition contracts. And I don't think there's an overall response that is valid everywhere. But with the analysis of three-month analyses, 3 years of plan, 30 years of impact, that has then permeated to Spain. I think there are certain initiatives that could be valid, but obviously have to be appropriate for the local setting. And in terms of tourism, there's also scope in the tourism industry for Spain. The tourist sector is very, very important. It's above 11% of our GDP. So I think, and there is scope for improving efficiency there. So probably those would be the sectors to focus if someone asked me from a Spanish perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you agree, I'm sorry for that, but we're going out of time, so we might need to, if at least the three panelists can stay for more, 5 or 10 minutes more, that will give us the possibility to conclude a little bit better. And sorry for the participants who will have to leave. Matthias, what is your take on these issues of debt and savings, and also on the issue of the recovery and the investment plans and the different sectors and conditionalities that could be averted?
So first on the sectors, I would highlight 3 buildings for the reasons Lara mentioned. It's long term, it's absolutely important. Germany and all member states are significantly behind the renovation rates that we must see. Currently in Germany it's around 1%. We need to be at 3% per year of the existing building stock to be on a pathway to long-term greenhouse gas neutrality, and talking about deep renovation, not only superficial renovation. So it's a very important sector. Another one is industry, because of the reinvestment needs in industry, particularly in the energy intensive industries. There is a major reinvestment cycle coming up in the next decade. And it means that, and this will require some public support, because the green technologies are not yet cost competitive. So there will need to be some support. If not now, when will it still be possible in the future? That's a big question mark. So it needs to happen now. And the last one is just accelerating further the power sector transition. So phasing out coal, scaling up renewables much faster than we have seen. If we want to increase climate ambition in Europe, we need to triple the renewables deployment rate across the continent per year compared to what we did during the last decade. So there's also, it's a big challenge, but it's also a big opportunity also for industrial policy development. We have a very competitive wind industry in Europe, and giving the high level of automation of producing solar PV, for instance, there's a good case to also see some relocalization of the PV industry coming back to Europe, if the conditions are right. Now, this being said, conditionality. Conditionality, I think, is very potentially toxic a topic when you're discussing conditionalities in an emergency situation. So what are we talking about? And I think it's important to break it down, what we are talking about. First of all, the basic fact is that you can spend public money only once. So if you spend it, you should not only look at the economic stimulus, but also be mindful of the long-term need to decarbonize the economy. Now, there are a few challenges on the way. What projects? And if you look into the preparation of member states, regions, municipalities to identify projects that should be prioritized now, you have vastly different states of preparation. Some member states are very well prepared, and I would actually see Poland quite well prepared for that. It's not so well known, but they have really done a lot of analysis in recent months. But other member states are really not prepared. And so then the question is, what do you support? Do we have shovel-ready projects, as Lara said, yes or no? So shovel-ready projects pushing into the right direction. And there really needs to be a major effort at this point to identify the projects that would be pushing into the right direction if financed. Then the question is, what do you finance? How do you finance? And I would call this like the governance and the delivery mechanism of the conditionality. In many situations, if you talk to the people involved in project financing in the European Investment Bank, in the German KfW, the French bank, there is a real lack of bankable projects, so to speak. And there needs to be much more support given to develop bankable projects, particularly where the capacity to do it is not so well developed. And in Germany, we don't have a big problem, but in many parts of Europe, there is a real problem. And this is one of the biggest criticisms on the Juncker Investment Fund. Of course, it was hitting the best where there was readiness to absorb this type of funding, but when you have not the capacity, when you do not have the capacity to develop the projects, the bankable projects, you simply will not manage to benefit from all the financing that is now put on offer. And then on the type of conditionality that we are talking about, I think exactly as Lara said, we are not saying yes or no. No, you cannot be because you're not green. Of course not. We're talking about 2050 greenhouse gas neutrality. We're not talking about 2021 greenhouse gas neutrality. But what we need to see is for investments that are being supported by public funds, that there's a clear commitment to move onto the trajectory of greenhouse gas neutrality, particularly when it is a long-term investment. So to have a clear planning for reducing emissions from a certain industry, from a certain from a certain sector. I think it's important. What are we talking about? We're not talking about, no, you cannot emit tomorrow, but we need to see you engaging on the long-term project of greenhouse gas neutrality.
Thank you very much. I think I wanted to just have you a final word on one of the questions about your prognosis about the future. I must confess that there were also very interesting questions from the audience that were targeted as another cluster about the potential that we should actually look for rather degrowth than continuing to think that growth is the solution to our problems if we want to stay within our planetary boundaries. This would be a whole seminar, and I'm not saying it's not an important question. I don't want to say this is just about dreams. I really believe this is an important question, but this was where each of you would need at least 10 minutes, to say the least, to give a structured opinion on that question. My point would probably just to say that for the moment, as our societies are structured, we need that growth for jobs and the well-being of people. But that would be probably, you shouldn't have to agree with me on that. But another consequence of that type of questions was a colleague from Sciences Po in Colombia asking, there are other things happening about the social mobilization of people, the links between people, there are ideas of how we could work together, a kind of a solidarity economy that is for the moment not very present in the Green Deal discussion. And this is probably something that we also need to bear in mind. So I'm just hinting at that rather than asking you the question, but I believe this is of course something that we did not have time to discuss. My question to you, to the three of you in a short conclusive sentence is, how do you see what is your vision of what are the next steps from the Commission side and the Council side about this recovery plan? Do you feel it's going in the right direction, or what would be your vision of risks and opportunities? And particularly, how is that linked to the possibility of the European Union to increase its climate ambition ahead of COP26, meaning going to 55% as was initially planned? So a kind of a perspective view on how you see what's going to be possible. I don't know, Xavier, if you want to get into that type of perspective discussion, but I'm happy to have you answer first.
Yeah, of course, thank you. I would make just 2 points. I think that this crisis is helping us to understand what transportation is, how transportation is important for our societies. And so that could be an interesting thing to put on the table. And there's a clear link with transportation and CO2 emissions. And so it's also showing that there is a strong lever. I also do believe that, but this is a little bit a side problem to the Green Deal, but it is in a sense related to that there is a reflection to be conducted at the European level with the way we deal with crisis, health crisis, but also maybe climatic crisis in the future. And I think that there's clearly a need for a supranational body which is able to help national states in dealing with crisis, helping them with stuff, machines, equipment, but also help with people or money, but also with procedures at the European level. And that can be also part of the Green Deal. I mean, it's not, the Green Deal is not only about climate change or climate change mitigation, it's also about climate change adaptation, and crises are going to be part of climate change adaptation. And so dealing with crisis, climate crisis, health crisis, migrant crisis is something which is important to do it with all the respect of the principle that we defend all.
Thank you, Xavier. And I think that relates also to some of the questions about governance and transparency, and so that we can learn also about the governance of the European Union. I think Matthias alluded to that by talking about the delivery mechanism and the way we assess and make things transparent. Lara, I forgot to mention also some things that, of course, we did not have time to mention, which is about the European taxonomy on sustainable finance. That can be also a help to try and filter what are the bankable projects, just so that this is not just forgotten and somebody in the chat mentioned it. But Lara, what would be your concluding words?
Yes, and in complementing the idea of the taxonomy and the lack of bankable projects and the lack of climate finance, I think, again, it's absolutely crucial to have a strong, robust so-called European climate law with science at its heart, and with science and independent scientific bodies, both at the EU level and at the member state level. Because if we don't align our goals and our trajectories with what science tells us we have to do, we're just going to miss the mark by a large margin. So on the point about raising climate ambition and whether we're going to get to COP26 in 2021 with a 55%, I do hope so. I think the leaked report about having delayed COP26 might give a bit of an extra time for a complex impact assessment, and delays are abundant in member states as well. In Spain, for example, we have our administrative procedures on hold. So I believe probably delays are on the cards. I also believe there's an opportunity. So perhaps a bit more time, but I would hope that the Commission and the European Union as a whole doesn't waste this opportunity to be more present in that fragmented climate leadership space, because we have the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement according to Article 28 of the agreement in November, and China, we know, are struggling with an updated and enhanced national determined contribution. So I think if Europe is not there as in its mediator role, leading plus mediator, and as a leader by example, then the future of climate governance and climate action looks quite bleak.
Thank you, Lara. That's really another reason why we need to have an ambitious Green Deal in Europe for that purpose exactly. Matthias.
Yes, I was not sure, Lara, whether it was optimistic what you said or not. I tend to be a professional optimist. So I'm in looking where we have been a few weeks ago on, let's say, the dualism of the economic recovery in Europe being a sound economic recovery, but also recovering into the right direction. I'm much more optimistic than I was a few weeks ago. I believe at the narrative level, the political narrative level, we are there. Now, the question is, will we also follow through at the level of specific decisions, specific packages developed in national capitals and then finalized in dialogue with the European Commission? And there, the jury is open at the moment. It's out there. I do believe that we will need a lot of transparency, a lot of public pressure to actually follow through, to have more than just good words on paper on the dualism. But then if we manage to actually do have prioritized the green recovery projects and delayed or at least conditioned somewhat the not so nice recovery projects from a climate perspective, then we are really on the best track to also have a consensus decision by the end of this year to increase Europe's climate target, because then we will have in a way front-loaded the hard breaking through some of the lobbies and the debates that we have been struggling with for such a long time. And then it is really about following through also on those choices. I really believe that in the next 3 months, when we come to more concrete decisions on the recovery packages at political level, but also at financing level, that we will then also have a good sense of whether we can increase climate ambition. If we manage that, then we will also have the minus 55% in December.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you for the optimism. And I think, like Lara, it's we are optimistic if we do a good job. So it's conditioned by our capacity to participate to this debate. And that was really the intention of this webinar, to be able to have a kind of a European level conversation, but also grounded in our national political contexts. So thank you very much, Matthias, Lara, Xavier. This was really tremendously interesting presentations. Lots of questions. We did not manage to have them all answered. I just wanted to mention that we have been at some point 600, so 470 on Zoom and 130 on YouTube. And the whole webinar will be on replay on our website. So that is good also for those who haven't had the capacity to have it all, to be able to see it again. And I really want to thank Nicolas Bermans and Karine Antunes from the IDRI team to have made that possible. Of course, big thanks to the presenters and the participants. Hope to have another conversation to see if we've managed to make your optimism come true in a few weeks or months from now. Maybe we will rearrange such a discussion. In terms for what concerns climate and biodiversity negotiations globally, we will organize a webinar next week on Thursday afternoon on the international climate and biodiversity agenda and how the recovery plans might be hindering or facilitating it. So that's another follow-up on the conversation. A big thank you again to you three. Have a safe kind of day and weekend in your respective capitals. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.